Imagine waking up one Sunday morning, the smell of coffee in the air, maybe you're planning to go to church or spend time with family, and then in just 2 hours, your entire world changes forever. That's exactly what happened on December 7th, 1941, when Japan launched one of the most audacious military strikes in human history. A plan so bold, so meticulously crafted, that it aimed to cripple the most powerful naval fleet on Earth in a single morning. This wasn't just an attack. This was a calculated gamble that would determine the fate of nations, and today we're diving deep into how Japan planned to destroy America before breakfast. So here's the thing most people don't realize. Japan didn't wake up one day and randomly decide to attack Pearl Harbor. This was years in the making, a strategic chess game played across the entire Pacific Ocean, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. To understand why Japan would even consider attacking the United States, we need to go back a bit and look at what was happening in the world at that time. It's 1941, and if you think the world is complicated now, let me tell you, back then it was absolute chaos. Japan had big dreams. We're talking empire-level ambitions. They wanted to create what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds kind of noble, right? But here's what it really meant. Japan wanted to control basically all of East Asia and the Pacific. They wanted the resources, the territory, the power, and they were already well on their way. They had invaded Manchuria in 1931. They were deep into a brutal war with China that started in 1937, and they had their eyes on Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia, because that's where the oil was. Now here's where America comes into the picture. The United States wasn't thrilled about Japan's expansion at all. Americans were watching Japan commit atrocities in China, and the US government started putting pressure on Japan. Economic pressure. They froze Japanese assets in the United States. They cut off oil exports to Japan. They implemented trade embargoes. And for Japan, this was a massive problem because here's something crucial. Japan imported about 80% of its oil. 80%. Without oil, their military machine would grind to a halt. Their ships couldn't sail, their planes couldn't fly, their tanks couldn't roll. They were essentially being strangled economically. So Japan had a choice to make. They could back down, withdraw from China, give up their imperial ambitions, and play nice with the United States. Or they could double down. And guess what they chose? They decided that if they were going to secure the resources they needed in Southeast Asia, they had to neutralize the one force that could stop them, the United States Pacific Fleet. And where was that fleet conveniently located? Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now let's talk about the mastermind behind this whole operation. His name was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and this guy is one of the most fascinating figures in military history. Here's the ironic twist that'll blow your mind. Yamamoto actually studied at Harvard University. He lived in America. He traveled across the country. He understood American industrial power better than most Japanese leaders. And because of that, he actually opposed going to war with the United States. Yeah, you heard that right. The man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack didn't even want to fight America. Yamamoto knew something that many of his colleagues in the Japanese military didn't fully grasp. He understood that America's industrial capacity was absolutely enormous. He reportedly said something like, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have no confidence." He knew that in a prolonged war, America would eventually crush Japan with sheer production power. But here's the thing, Yamamoto was a military officer, and when his government decided they were going to war, his job wasn't to question the policy. His job was to figure out how to win. And Yamamoto came up with a plan that was so risky, so unprecedented, that many people thought it was impossible. The idea was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. Send a massive carrier strike force across the Pacific Ocean, maintain complete radio silence, approach Hawaii undetected, and then launch a surprise attack that would destroy the American Pacific Fleet in one devastating blow. The hope was that this would buy Japan enough time to secure the resources they needed in Southeast Asia and establish such a strong defensive perimeter that America would eventually negotiate for peace rather than fight a long, costly war. But pulling this off required solving problems that had never been solved before. First, there was the issue of distance. The strike force would have to travel over 3,000 miles across open ocean without being detected. They chose a route through the northern Pacific, where weather was terrible and shipping lanes were empty. It was risky because of storms and rough seas, but it also meant they were less likely to be spotted. Then there was the issue of Pearl Harbor itself. The harbor was shallow, only about 40 feet deep in many places. Traditional aerial torpedoes would sink too deep into the water and bury themselves in the mud before hitting their targets. So Japanese engineers had to design special shallow running torpedoes with wooden fins. They studied the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in 1940 and learned from it. They practiced and refined their techniques. This wasn't some thrown-together operation. This was methodical, precise, obsessive planning. They also developed armor-piercing bombs specifically designed to penetrate the thick armored decks of battleships. These bombs were actually converted 16-inch naval shells fitted with fins. They had to be dropped from high altitude to build up enough speed to punch through the armor. Japanese pilots trained relentlessly for months, practicing on mock-ups of Pearl Harbor. They studied maps, photographs, intelligence reports. They knew the layout of Pearl Harbor better than some of the American sailors stationed there. Now let's talk about what America was doing during all this. Were they completely blind to what was coming? Not exactly. Tensions between the US and Japan were obviously high. American intelligence had actually broken the Japanese diplomatic code, something called Purple. They could read Japanese diplomatic messages. They knew that relations were deteriorating. They knew that war was a possibility. But here's the critical failure. Nobody expected Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. Why? Because it seemed too far, too risky, too bold. Most American military leaders thought that if Japan attacked, it would be in the Philippines, which was much closer to Japan, or maybe some other target in Southeast Asia. The idea that Japan would send their carriers on a risky voyage across thousands of miles of ocean to attack the main American naval base seemed almost suicidal. It violated conventional military wisdom. Carriers were considered too valuable to risk in such a bold offensive operation. So even though America was on alert, even though there were war warnings sent out, Pearl Harbor felt safe. It felt secure. It was home territory, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. What could possibly go wrong? On November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike force departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. This was one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku. These carriers held over 400 aircraft. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 tankers for refueling at sea. This wasn't a raiding party, this was an armada. And they sailed in complete radio silence, not a single transmission. They maintained strict blackout conditions at night. They refueled at sea, which was technically challenging in rough northern Pacific waters. Every day they wondered if they'd be discovered. Every day they watched the skies for American patrol planes. The tension must have been unbearable. Imagine being on one of those ships, knowing that if you're discovered, the element of surprise is gone and your mission might turn into a death trap. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo, diplomats were still talking. Japanese envoys were meeting with American officials, discussing negotiations. On December 6th, American intelligence intercepted a 13-part Japanese message. They decoded it overnight. It was clear that Japan was breaking off negotiations, but it still didn't explicitly mention an attack, and it didn't mention Pearl Harbor. There was a 14th part that said Japan would deliver a response at 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th. Some people in American intelligence thought this timing was significant. 1 p.m. in Washington would be early morning in Hawaii. But the warning didn't reach Pearl Harbor in time, or at least not in a way that prompted immediate defensive action. December 7, 1941, a Sunday morning. Sundays were typically quieter on military bases. Some sailors had shore leave, others were sleeping in. The weather was beautiful, clear skies, calm waters. It was supposed to be a peaceful day. At 6 a.m., the Japanese carriers reached their launch point, about 230 miles north of Rahu. The seas were rough, and the carriers were pitching in the waves, making takeoff dangerous. But they had come too far to turn back now. At 6:10 a.m., the first wave began launching. 183 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack. As his plane climbed into the sky and turned south toward Oahu, he and his pilots must have felt a mixture of excitement, fear, and determination. They were about to change history. At 7:02 a.m., two American privates operating a mobile radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Rahu picked up something unusual. A large blip on their screen showing many aircraft approaching from the north. They reported it to the information center, but here's where things went wrong. The officer who received the report, a lieutenant with very little experience, assumed it was a group of American B-17 bombers that were expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He told the radar operators not to worry about it. Those words, "don't worry about it," might be some of the most costly words ever spoken in American military history. At 7:48 a.m., Commander Fuchida looked down and saw Pearl Harbor spread out below him. Ships lined up neatly in rows, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. It must have looked like a dream target. Fuchida gave the order to attack and sent the famous signal, Tora, 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 which meant tiger, tiger, tiger. It was the code word indicating they had achieved complete surprise. And then all hell broke loose. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the water, releasing their weapons at Battleship Row, where 7 battleships were moored. Dive bombers screamed down from above. High-altitude bombers dropped their armor-piercing bombs. Fighters strafed aircraft on the ground. The sound must have been deafening. Explosions, gunfire, screaming engines, shouting men. The USS Arizona took a catastrophic hit. An armor-piercing bomb penetrated her forward magazine, where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder was stored. The resulting explosion was so massive it lifted the entire front of the ship out of the water. The Arizona sank in minutes, taking 1,177 men with her. That single ship accounted for nearly half of all American deaths that day. Today, the Arizona still sits at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, a tomb for those sailors and a memorial to that terrible morning. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes on her port side. She rolled over and capsized, trapping over 400 men inside. Some survived in air pockets, and rescue crews spent hours cutting through the hull to free them, but many couldn't be reached in time. The USS West Virginia took multiple torpedo and bomb hits and sank at her mooring. The USS California was torpedoed and began to sink. The USS Nevada, incredibly, managed to get underway during the attack. She was the only battleship to do so. Seeing her move, Japanese pilots concentrated on trying to sink her in the channel to block the harbor entrance, but Nevada's crew managed to beach her before she could sink and block the channel. The USS Pennsylvania was in dry dock and took less damage. The USS Maryland and Tennessee were inboard of other ships and were partially shielded, but still they took hits. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese attack sank or badly damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 other vessels. 188 American aircraft were destroyed, mostly on the ground. Another 159 were damaged. And the human cost: 2,335 American servicemen killed, 68 civilians killed, over 1,000 people wounded. But here's something important that often gets overlooked. For all the devastation, the attack wasn't a complete success from Japan's strategic standpoint. The American aircraft carriers which would prove to be the most important ships in the Pacific War, weren't at Pearl Harbor that day. The USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was on a mission to Midway. The USS Saratoga was on the West Coast undergoing maintenance. These carriers survived, and they would form the core of America's counter-offensive in the Pacific. Also, the Japanese attack focused on ships. They largely ignored Pearl Harbor's infrastructure. The fuel storage tanks, which held millions of gallons of oil, weren't destroyed. The repair facilities, the dry docks, the maintenance shops all survived mostly intact. If Japan had destroyed these, it would have forced the American fleet to fall back to the West Coast, thousands of miles away. Instead, Pearl Harbor remained functional as a base, and many of the damaged ships were eventually repaired and returned to service. There was supposed to be a third wave of attacks. Some Japanese commanders wanted to launch another strike to finish the job, to destroy those fuel tanks and repair facilities. But Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier strike force, decided against it. He had achieved his primary objective. He didn't know where the American carriers were, and he was worried about a counterattack, so he withdrew. Some historians think this was a critical mistake, that a third wave could have extended American recovery time by months or even a year. Now let's talk about the aftermath and what this attack actually achieved versus what Japan hoped it would achieve. The immediate tactical result was devastating for America. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships, which at the time were considered the ultimate measure of naval power, were sunk or damaged. American military prestige took a huge hit. But strategically, the attack was arguably one of the biggest miscalculations in military history. Remember Yamamoto's prediction? He could run wild for 6 months to a year. He was almost exactly right. For the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved victory after victory. They captured the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces fought desperately but were eventually forced to surrender in what became the Bataan Death March. They took Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, which was supposedly an impregnable British fortress. They captured the Dutch East Indies and its precious oil fields. They took Burma. They threatened Australia. They pushed across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a tidal wave. It looked unstoppable. But here's what Japan didn't count on. America's response wasn't to negotiate for peace. It was pure, furious determination for total victory. December 7, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. He called it a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Within days, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States, bringing America fully into World War II on both the European and Pacific fronts. The attack on Pearl Harbor did something that nothing else could have done. It unified America. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans were divided about entering World War II. There was a strong isolationist movement. People didn't want to get involved in another foreign war. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Suddenly, America had been attacked on its own soil. The debate was over. Young men flooded recruiting stations. Women went to work in factories. The entire nation mobilized for war on a scale that's hard to even comprehend today. American industrial capacity, the thing Yamamoto feared, shifted into high gear. Factories that made cars started making tanks and planes. Shipyards that built passenger ships started building warships and cargo vessels. The numbers are staggering. During World War II, America produced roughly 300,000 aircraft, 80,000 tanks, 2,600 Liberty ships, dozens of aircraft carriers, hundreds of other naval vessels. This was production on a scale the world had never seen. Japan couldn't compete. Their economy was a fraction of America's size. They were trying to fight a giant. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide turned. American code breakers figured out that Japan was planning to attack Midway Island. American carriers, those same ones that weren't at Pearl Harbor, set up an ambush. In one of the most decisive naval battles in history, America sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. These were 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and, critically, many of their most experienced pilots. They never fully recovered from this loss. Midway was the turning point. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. The war in the Pacific became a brutal island-hopping campaign. Americans fought their way across the Pacific, capturing islands, building airfields, moving closer to Japan, places with names that became legendary in American military history. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle was incredibly costly. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination. They rarely surrendered. They launched kamikaze attacks, suicide missions where pilots deliberately crashed their planes into American ships. The fighting was savage, close quarters, no mercy given or asked. Meanwhile, American submarines were strangling Japan's economy. They sank Japanese merchant ships, cutting off the flow of resources from Japan's conquered territories back to the home islands. Remember, Japan started this whole war to secure resources. Now they couldn't even transport those resources because American subs were hunting them. By 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing. Their people were starving. Their cities were being firebombed by American B-29 bombers. And then came August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, atomic bombs. Japan surrendered. The war that Japan hoped to win quickly by knocking out America at Pearl Harbor ended with Japan's complete defeat, occupied by American forces, stripped of its empire, its cities in ruins, millions of its people dead. It's one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Yamamoto didn't live to see the end. He was killed in 1943 when American fighters, acting on intelligence that decoded his travel plans, ambushed and shot down his plane over the Solomon Islands. The man who planned Pearl Harbor died in a targeted assassination, planned by the same American intelligence services he had once caught by surprise. So what lessons came from Pearl Harbor? Military strategists studied it for decades. It revolutionized naval warfare. Pearl Harbor proved that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the dominant force in naval combat. It showed the importance of intelligence and the danger of intelligence failures. America learned painful lessons about complacency, about the need for vigilance, about not underestimating your enemies. But there's a bigger lesson here about human nature and about war. Japan's plan to destroy America in one morning was based on a flawed assumption. They assumed that America was soft, that Americans lacked the will to fight a long, hard war, that a devastating surprise attack would break American morale. They couldn't have been more wrong. The attack had the exact opposite effect. It awakened a sleeping giant, just as Yamamoto himself had feared. It turned an uncertain, divided America into a unified, determined war machine bent on total victory. Think about the individuals involved in this story. The young sailors sleeping on the Arizona who had no idea they had minutes left to live. The radar operators who spotted the incoming attack but were dismissed. The Japanese pilots who trained for months and then flew into battle knowing many of them wouldn't return. Commander Fuchida, who led the attack and actually survived the entire war and later became a Christian missionary in America. The civilians in Hawaii who suddenly found themselves in a war zone. President Roosevelt, who had to lead a nation through its darkest hour. All of these people, Japanese and American, were caught up in decisions made by governments and military leaders, and their lives were changed forever. Pearl Harbor also raises uncomfortable questions about intelligence and warnings. American intelligence had picked up signs that something was coming. There were indicators, but connecting dots in real time with incomplete information is incredibly difficult. It's easy to look back with hindsight and say the signs were obvious. But when you're living through it, when you're dealing with thousands of pieces of information, most of which turn out to be irrelevant, figuring out which warnings are real is enormously challenging. This is still a problem today. Intelligence agencies are always trying to balance being alert to threats without crying wolf so often that people stop listening. There's also a human tendency to assume that things will continue as they are. In late 1941, there had been years of tension with Japan, but there hadn't been an attack. It's natural to think that tomorrow will be like today. This is called normalcy bias. It's why people ignore warnings sometimes. It's why Pearl Harbor felt safe even though, logically, it was a potential target. People thought, we've always been safe here, why would that change? This is a dangerous way of thinking, but it's very human. One of the most moving aspects of Pearl Harbor is what happened to the survivors and how they remembered that day. For many of them, Pearl Harbor defined their entire lives. They carried the memories, the trauma, the loss of friends. Every year on December 7th, survivors would gather at Pearl Harbor to remember. They'd meet with survivors from the other side too, former Japanese pilots. These meetings were emotional, complex. These men had tried to kill each other once. Now they were old men, remembering a war that happened when they were young. Some found forgiveness. Some held onto anger. All of them were haunted by that morning. The USS Arizona Memorial, which sits above the sunken battleship, is one of the most visited sites in Hawaii. People from around the world come to pay respects. Inside, there's a wall with the names of the men who died on the Arizona. Many survivors of the Arizona asked to be buried with their shipmates after they died. Their ashes were placed inside the wreck by divers. They wanted to be reunited with the men they served with. That's brotherhood. That's loyalty that transcends death. Today, Pearl Harbor serves as a reminder of several things. It reminds us that war can come suddenly, that complacency is dangerous, that intelligence matters, that underestimating your opponent is a fatal mistake. It reminds us of the cost of war, the lives lost, the suffering endured. But it also reminds us of resilience, of how people can recover from devastating losses, of how nations can come together in crisis. Japan and America, countries that fought one of the most brutal wars in history, are now close allies. Japan is a democratic, peaceful nation. America helped rebuild Japan after the war. Former enemies became friends. That's not common in history. Usually conflicts leave lasting hatred. But sometimes, just sometimes, people manage to move beyond past wars and build something better. That's a hopeful message from a very dark chapter. For Japan, Pearl Harbor represents a different kind of lesson. It's a reminder of what happens when military ambition overrides rational strategy, when leaders convince themselves they can win an unwinnable war. Japan's military leadership knew they couldn't match America's industrial power. Yamamoto told them so directly, but they chose war anyway, driven by nationalism, by pride, by a belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Millions of Japanese people paid the price for that decision. Their cities were destroyed. Their economy collapsed. They lost the war completely. Every nation needs to remember that leaders' decisions have consequences for ordinary people. Plan to destroy America in one morning was brilliant in its execution. The tactical planning was superb. The coordination, the secrecy, the training, all of it was world-class military operation. But strategically, it was a disaster. It brought America into the war fully committed to Japan's destruction. It ensured that the war would be fought to the bitter end. It gave America a rallying cry that unified the nation. Remember Pearl Harbor became a slogan that carried through the entire war. Every bomb dropped on Japan, every island captured, every Japanese ship sunk, Americans remembered Pearl Harbor. So here we are, more than 80 years later, still talking about Pearl Harbor, still learning from it, still mourning the loss of life. History is full of what-ifs. What if Japan hadn't attacked? What if they had destroyed the carriers? What if they had launched that third wave? What if American intelligence had connected the dots and Pearl Harbor was ready? What if Japan had listened to Yamamoto and never gone to war with America? We can't know the answers. We only know what happened. What we can say is that Pearl Harbor changed the world. It brought America into World War II, which meant that the Allies had the resources and manpower to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Without America in the war, the outcome might have been very different. Europe might still be under Nazi control. Asia might still be under Japanese control. The world we live in today was shaped by what happened that Sunday morning in Hawaii. The people who lived through Pearl Harbor are almost all gone now. The last survivors are in their 90s and 100s. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers that day firsthand. That's why it's important to keep telling the story, to make sure future generations understand what happened and why it matters. Pearl Harbor isn't just a history lesson. It's a reminder of the cost of war, the importance of vigilance, the danger of complacency, and the resilience of the human spirit. Japan's plan to destroy America in one morning succeeded tactically but failed strategically in the most spectacular way possible. They sank ships but awakened a nation. They won a battle but lost the war. They achieved surprise but lost the advantage. It's one of the great ironies of history. The attack that was supposed to keep America out of the war ensured America's total commitment to Japan's defeat. Sometimes, the consequences of our actions are the exact opposite of what we intended. That's a lesson that applies far beyond military strategy. It applies to life. So the next time you're facing a decision, especially a big one, think about Pearl Harbor. Think about how short-term tactical thinking can lead to long-term strategic disaster. Think about how underestimating others can come back to destroy you. Think about how actions have consequences, often unintended ones. Think about how the easy path, the aggressive path, the path that seems to solve all your problems quickly, might actually be the path that leads to ruin. And remember the people, the sailors who died never knowing why their ship was exploding, the pilots who flew into the attack believing they were serving their country, the families who got the telegram saying their son, brother, husband, father was gone, the survivors who carried the memories forever. War isn't abstract. It's not just about strategy and battles and winners and losers. It's about people. It's about lives destroyed, families broken, futures stolen. Pearl Harbor was one morning, a few hours, but it echoed through the years and changed millions of lives. That's the power of a single moment in history. That's why we study it, remember it, learn from it. Because if we forget, if we think it can't happen again, if we become complacent, we risk repeating the same mistakes. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The details change, but human nature stays the same. Pride, ambition, fear, anger, these things drove nations to war in 1941, and they still drive conflicts today. So yeah, Japan had a plan to destroy America in one morning, and in some ways they succeeded. They destroyed ships, killed thousands, shocked the nation, but they didn't destroy America. They didn't break American will. They didn't achieve their strategic objectives. Instead, they guaranteed their own defeat. That's the real story of Pearl Harbor. Not just what happened that morning, but what it led to, what it meant, what it teaches us. And that's a story worth remembering.